October 1st, 2019. China celebrates its 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. It's a day of immense significance as the people paid homage to the Communist Party's leadership. After a century of humiliation, China is now marching forward with its newfound confidence and vigor as a new global power. From a war-battered and poverty-stricken nation on the verge of collapse, to a leading industrial powerhouse and the world's second largest economy in a span of just 70 years. And today, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China pushes the envelope to achieve what he called the China Dream. What really accounts for China's meteoric rise as a major global power within 7 decades? Can this dramatic success be sustained in today's challenging global economic environment?
中国人民从此站起来了，在这一伟大事件彻底改变了近代以后100多年中国积贫积弱、受人欺凌的悲惨命运。
A picturesque farming village, alluring mountain ranges, breathtaking views of the valleys and the lush green fields greet visitors in this old town of Shidu, some 300 kilometers away from Beijing, China's capital city. This was how the whole of China looked like 70 years ago. A predominantly agricultural country with the majority of its population living in the countryside. That was also what Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong inherited when he proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. Despite his remarkable success in defeating the nationalist Kuomintang forces and unifying the whole country under the leadership of the Communist Party, China remained a very poor and backward country. More than 80% of the Chinese people lived in absolute poverty.
I would say he inherited a mess. What made the difference was he created something. He created something that China had not seen for nearly 100 years, a united country. It had been divided after the Opium War, Civil War inside, even under the Qing dynasty. And then the revolution, warlords, civil war, invasion by the Japanese. It was one long tale of disasters, wars, poverty, increasingly dismal future for China. China was at its weakest, in fact, during those years of the Japanese invasion and the civil war that followed. I mean, in 1945 to 49, when the nationalists and communists fought, the nationalists were obviously so weak and so corrupt, they had no real chance of defeating, of winning, although nobody quite anticipated the speed at which they fell. But the fact that the communists won is Mao Zedong's creation. He made that possible.
In the 10 years that followed the founding of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao set the country on the tremendous growth trajectory. Industrial output was growing double-digit every year. But the great leap forward, the industrialization of China, soon began to falter.
Within the party, when they had disagreements among the leaders, and the mistakes that Mao Zedong made with the great leap forward, and then when his comrades challenged him about that, he didn't like it. He got more and more deeply embroiled in a kind of internal party struggle, which led to the Cultural Revolution.
The Cultural Revolution, however, failed to repair the damage caused by his economic policy of the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's vision of the rapid industrialization of China, but at the expense of agriculture. The failure of the economic experiment brought with it the Great Chinese Famine of 1959, which lasted till 1961. The Cultural Revolution that followed only made the situation worse. The 10-year social experiment crippled the Chinese economy, which led to a prolonged period of turmoil, bloodshed, and starvation. According to estimates, the Cultural Revolution killed between 500,000 and 2 million people. It was a massive policy failure and one of the darkest chapters in Chinese history. It was only in December of 1968 that Mao realized that the Cultural Revolution was spiraling out of control. The policy that paralyzed China, politically and economically, finally ended in 1976, following the death of Mao Zedong and the fall of the Gang of Four, a group of Chinese Communist Party members closely associated with Mao. Although the end of the Cultural Revolution came at the cost of so many lives, until today, Mao remains a revered figure in China.
Despite the errors and the miscalculations of the Cultural Revolution and so on, they didn't actually destroy that base of a sense of unity, a sense of oneness of China, a sense of tremendous potential. Even though he got it wrong, the sense was somehow still there.
After his success in reuniting China, Mao Zedong had envisioned that his revolutionary movement would turn the country into a beacon of communism, a prosperous country committed to the communist ideology. He failed. But his failure to realize his vision had paved the way for the rise of a new leader, whose radical reform policies led to the emergence of China as a new economic superpower. The man responsible for China's meteoric rise was 74-year-old Deng Xiaoping, formerly the Secretary General of the Communist Party. China's phenomenal transformation into a modern industrialized economy did not happen by accident. It was made possible by the work and ideas of one man, the late Chinese paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. Standing at just 1.52 meters tall, his diminutive figure belied the strength, vision, and fortitude of the man who helped transform China into one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Deng Xiaoping was indeed a giant among equals, towering above the achievements of many other leaders in modern times. With his courage, vision, and ideas, he helped lay the foundation for the rise of China into an economic superpower that it is today.
In a way, they learned from the mistakes of Mao Zedong to follow Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping actually thought for 10 years, he sat down and thought about what went wrong with what had been so successful. Don't forget, Deng Xiaoping was the Secretary General of the party while Mao Zedong was the chairman for 10 years. So he could see from inside something that was tremendously hopeful, tremendous potential, virtually destroyed by, in a way, the madness of this one man. The man who created it also was about to destroy it. And he sat back those 10 years quietly, thinking of, how do I remedy this? How do I save China, save the Communist Party from this near ruin that this great man who had created it in the first place had almost destroyed?
Deng Xiaoping took up the mantle of the leadership of the Communist Party at the age of 74. At that age, Victor felt that Deng was a man in a hurry to achieve something for the country. His main priority was to lift China out of its economic rut and pull millions of its people out of poverty.
Deng Xiaoping appreciated that he was not building from something from scratch. He was building from something that was there but went wrong, and he's remedying that.
And so he did. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping abandoned many communist doctrine and embraced free market principles instead. From state ownership and a centrally planned economy to one based on market-oriented reforms. In other words, Deng went against the grains of communist ideology by legalizing private ownership. He allowed market competition and opened China to the world through foreign investments and trade. He famously remarked, "It does not matter whether they are black cats or white cats. So long as they catch mice, they're good cats."
There were the four dragons in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. So they developed very fast and quickly became the manufacturing center of the world. So Deng saw that and he wants to follow a similar path. So he adopted very similar industrial policies by building domestic manufacturing base and using agriculture to subsidize industry. So by doing that, he lowered the cost of economic input for industrial development, and also he opened the coastal provinces, especially through Xinjiang. And by doing that, he captured this rising export economy, and that was a breaking point for China.
It ended up setting up special economic zones, getting China started on a trajectory of manufacturing success, of exporting to the rest of the world. It lifted over 600 million Chinese out of extreme poverty.
He had recognized that that was one of the mistakes of Mao Zedong, to have closed up the economy. If you don't have the capitalism or the methodologies and technologies of capitalism to create the wealth, what is there to redistribute? We must get to the stage where we must create wealth. And what he did was he basically opened the doors to say, let everybody who can create wealth, create wealth. Only then we have a chance to build a social society.
And so Deng's gamble in converting a planned economy into a market economy paid off. From a per capita income of just $40 in 1978, it has now risen to more than $10,000. The country's economy has also expanded at an average rate of 9.5% over the last 40 years. The changes that Deng had initiated have transformed China from one of the world's poorest countries into the world's second biggest economy. As a testimony to the success of Deng's reform efforts, Shenzhen has surpassed Hong Kong in GDP numbers for the first time in history. And Shenzhen's success formula has been implemented in second and third tier cities across China. However, in the spring of 1989, pro-democracy protests broke out on Tiananmen Square, casting a pall over China's nascent market economy and liberal reforms. Chinese students had begun to demand for political reforms amid the ambitious economic reforms spearheaded by Deng. The central government, however, viewed the demonstrations as an existential challenge and went on to crush the movement.
Because the Tiananmen error was that they were so afraid that they opened up too fast and people were getting the wrong idea and the wrong direction, so they had to crush it. But then people began to be fearful about moving forward.
Deng left no room for doubt on China's way forward. The red line was cast in stone and could not be crossed. While he was prepared to allow for market reforms, there can be no challenge to the party's rule. But that has not stopped China's economic ascent as the next generation of Chinese leaders continue to ride on this expansionist wave, taking communist China to the halls of the World Trade Organization, integrating China deeper into the global economy. When Deng Xiaoping retired from politics in 1992, he had fulfilled a mission no other leader of the 20th century could have ever done. His groundbreaking reforms and his decision to open up China to the world have left a lasting impact on the country. It's not surprising then that his death in February 1997 did not lead to the abandonment of his economic policies. In fact, it further inspired the government to continue the material progress for the nation under new leader Jiang Zemin. Together with economic czar Zhu Rongji, they both took China to new heights.
And he sold the idea to a new generation of people who now are the leaders. He says successors, the generation from Jiang Zemin to Xi Jinping, are all, in a way, products of that new way of thinking. To build on the revolution that has succeeded, but constantly tweak it, make it better, improve on it, to ensure that it takes full advantages of all the opportunities available by opening up.
A major breakthrough came in December 2001 when China formally joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Its ascension into the WTO clearly signified China's deeper integration into the global economy and cemented its position as the world's factory, attracting numerous manufacturing companies from advanced economies into China.
Joining the World Trade Organization, they suddenly took advantage of the whole opening of the world's markets to Chinese entrepreneurship and access to all the world's resources. Following the rules, all the countries open up their markets to China, particularly the developed world of the United States and Western Europe. And those markets was really what made it possible for the Chinese economy to take off in such a rapid pace from then onwards. For the next 15 years or so, it just shot up. And you can see the figures show it. They show that after joining WTO, how things moved very, very fast, faster than anybody expected.
However, China's blistering growth, averaging 9.8% per annum, as well as its economic expansion that went on at such a breakneck speed, had begun to raise red flags. As it got richer, there were growing concerns over corruption and income inequality.
So one could say that that whole generation attempted to keep the economic engine growing, and that the real opportunity for genuine reform only came towards the end of that era, with Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao looking for ways to repair a system that had clearly grown unbalanced. Was investment too much an engine of growth? Was the government bloat in state-owned enterprises already too large? Was the environment too degraded? Had income inequality risen too high?
This wealth, this new wealth that was created, was corrupting the party itself. Now this is really dangerous.
It was against this backdrop that the leadership baton was passed onto the fifth generation. In November 2012, 59-year-old princeling Xi Jinping, the son of a communist revolutionary veteran, became China's new paramount leader. Shortly upon assuming power, President Xi Jinping embarked on an all-out anti-corruption drive aimed at rooting out corruption within the party. In 5 years, more than 200,000 high and low-ranking officials, known as tigers and flies, were prosecuted. Former Chongqing boss and member of the Politburo, Bo Xilai. A former member of the Politburo Standing Committee, Zhou Yongkang. And former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, General Xu Caihou. In spite of growing criticisms that his anti-corruption drive was aimed at getting rid of his rivals and those who are resistant to his policies, the campaign has won praises from the people. Having struck the right note at the very start of his leadership, Xi Jinping launched several signature policies in quick succession. These included Made in China 2025, a strategic blueprint to upgrade the country's manufacturing capabilities. This would include the goal of rising dominance in the fields of technology, IT, and robotics.
您好，我是悟空，全球首款拥有生命感的高档智能原型机器人。
The Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious global development strategy to build infrastructure and connectivity in 152 countries. These are all part of his desire to achieve the China Dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. 2 years into Xi Jinping's term, unexpected headwinds appeared on the horizon. In 2014, the Chinese economy grew at its slowest pace in 24 years, although it still clocked in a respectable 7.4% growth. And in 2016, the United States voted in a president who accused China of stealing jobs from America and cheating on trade deals. For all his tough anti-China rhetoric on the election campaign trail, nobody really believed that Donald Trump will make good on his threats on China. But he did. In July 2018, President Trump slapped taxes on billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports. And the two countries have been engaged in round after round of tit-for-tat retaliation measures since. The Chinese economy has undoubtedly been hit. GDP for the second quarter of 2019 grew at 6.2%, the lowest rate since quarterly reports began in 1992. When President Xi Jinping started his term with his vision of the China Dream, 中国梦, it galvanized and inspired an entire nation. It conjured hope and self-confidence. But as the world's most populous country, some 1.4 billion people, China has different age groups, different dialects, different religions. Can it be one China dream for everybody? How will Xi Jinping's vision propel the nation forward? Power, wealth, and respect. That's what Chinese leader Xi Jinping has envisioned for his country and his 1.4 billion population when he took over the mantle of leadership in 2012. Just weeks after he was installed as the Secretary General of the Communist Party, Xi came up with a slogan, the China Dream, and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. His key objective, to achieve prosperity at home and respect on the world stage, a vision of an economically prosperous and militarily strong nation.
Great means, in the eyes of the Chinese, it should be respected, to be looked up to as a civilization or as a power, as a wealthy country, for all sorts of reasons, but people look up to China with respect, admiration or something like that. I think that's what the Chinese believe, that China has been treated that way for a long time, most of the time. They have their downs, but when they're doing well, people respect it and admire China. And for 100 odd years, they were really down. So now they want to go back to the position when people will respect China. I think most Chinese leaders and intellectuals and so on want to restore that position.
Evidence has shown that China has already gained international respect and global admiration for all its achievements over the last 40 years. From one of the poorest countries in the world, it's now on the verge of joining the ranks of a high-income country. From an economy that was based on agriculture, it has now established itself as a global technology and manufacturing powerhouse, contributing to nearly 30% of the world's economic growth. It has also successfully lifted 850 million people out of poverty, and is on target to eradicate absolute poverty by the year 2020. China today is also the world's largest trading nation and an economy that's only second biggest in the world after the US. But China's newfound wealth and confidence have also been matched by its growing assertiveness overseas. It has been flexing its muscle in every sphere, including its maritime claims in the South China Sea and East China Sea. Beijing has also been moving rapidly to upgrade its military hardware and expand its powers overseas. Xi's government has also invested heavily in the Belt and Road Initiative to expand its economic reach and soft power abroad. Domestically, Xi Jinping has emerged as the most powerful leader since the era of Mao Zedong. Apart from his position as president and secretary general of the party, he has also taken full control of the military, assuming the title of Supreme Commander. And in a marked departure from party tradition, Xi Jinping successfully removed the term limits for president, something which former leader Deng Xiaoping tried to prevent. The constitutional amendment would now allow him to stay in office as president indefinitely. But 2019 has proven to be a challenging year for President Xi. China today has to battle challenges on many fronts. Ethnic tensions in Xinjiang continue to simmer as international human rights groups keep up the pressure on the Chinese authorities' handling of the Uyghur Muslims.
The Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group. There are more than 11 million of them. Most are Muslims, they have their own language, and they live in what's called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Ethnic tensions between the native Uyghur community and the majority Han Chinese have existed for years.
Uyghurs have often protested about being oppressed. Many have called for their own state, and some have organized attacks. While China hosted the Olympics, a series of bus bombings were claimed by a group called Turkestan Islamic Party. In 2009, there were riots and fighting between the Uyghurs and Han Chinese, and 200 people died, most of them ethnic Han. And in 2014, a bombing at a market and a knife attack at a railway station killed 30 people and injured more than 200. That's when China really came down hard on Xinjiang. They're an ethnic minority in China who say they're victims of horrific crimes. The UN thinks 1 million Uyghurs are being detained in camps, maybe more. China says it is putting Uyghurs in camps, but that they're job training centers, and that the accusations of abuse are a lie.
所谓中国在新疆实施种族灭绝和犯人类罪，彻头彻尾、蓄意炮制的、耸人听闻的伪命题和恶意的荒唐闹剧。
So what are we seeing? Well, the accusation is that China is trying to exterminate Uyghur culture and their identity. And activists and Uyghurs who've left Xinjiang say China's doing it in all kinds of ways. Forced labor, children being indoctrinated, women being sterilized or forced to have abortions. It's a long list of allegations. And then there's all those camps. We know there are hundreds of them in Xinjiang. Activists say Uyghurs from all walks of life, professors, doctors, public leaders, ordinary people too, are all detained without a warrant, charge, or trial. Even loyal supporters of the Communist Party haven't been spared. Getting a look inside one of these places hasn't been easy. Although Chinese state media have released their version of what goes on there.
Uyghurs are shown eagerly learning Chinese, getting job training, and dancing and singing songs praising the Communist Party.
An Australian think tank found that Uyghurs are being forced to work in factories in Xinjiang and beyond that are in the supply chains of well-known global brands. though brands like Apple and Nike have denied using forced labor. There are thousands of checkpoints, security cameras everywhere. Many use facial recognition. Rights groups say security forces also put QR codes outside Uyghur homes. There's even an app. Human Rights Watch says police use it to monitor people. China, though, says it's not doing anything wrong. There are no human rights violations, and this is all about developing Xinjiang's economy, maintaining peace and stability.
涉疆问题不是宗教、民族、人权问题，而是反暴恐和反分裂问题。
China says most Uyghurs have been released from re-education camps and found jobs. While at the United Nations, dozens of countries have condemned what's happening to the Uyghurs, but they can't exactly pass a resolution against China because it has veto power in the Security Council. Uyghurs even asked the International Criminal Court to investigate, but that went nowhere because the ICC has no jurisdiction in China. Plus, the US has also blacklisted Chinese officials and blocked certain imports from Xinjiang. And just before President Trump left the White House, his Secretary of State called what China's doing a genocide. President Biden's people agree.
All of that speaks to an effort to commit genocide.
重要的事情说3遍。中国没有种族灭绝。中国没有种族灭绝。中国没有种族灭绝。句号。
It's one thing to call something a genocide. It's another to prove it. The voices demanding justice are growing louder, and there are more of them all the time. That's not something that China or the world can easily tune out.
Welcome to this special episode of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming from Urumqi, capital of northwest China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. I'm pleased to be joined from London by Professor Graham Perry, visiting professor of dispute resolution at the University of International Business and Economics. So you have just finished a lengthy article on your thoughts and the origin and development and the conclusion of the so-called genocide and forced sterilization issues in Xinjiang recently. You argue that the Xinjiang allegations are all about security, territorial integrity and terrorism and have nothing to do with race, racial hatred or racial oppression. Could you elaborate on this argument and how you reach that conclusion?
The problems in Xinjiang arose out of the conflict between China and the Muslim separatists, the Muslim fundamentalists, and their attempts to set up an independent state. In other words, to separate the Xinjiang autonomous region from China. And that was an ongoing dispute. It's been quiet for the last 4 years, but it may flare up again. But there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of violence. The terrorists were very active. And in my article, I set out the details of the violent episodes that occurred when the separatists became violent in an attempt to force separatism on the People's Republic of China. That is how these events occurred. The way they're reported in the West is fundamentally different. The West reports it as genocide, as an attempt by the China state to remove large numbers of Uyghurs and to reduce their population significantly. That, by any definition, is genocide. Whether it's deaths, whether it's forced sterilization, it is reducing the number of people, hoping to eliminate their culture, their way of life, and their numbers. That is how the West has reported the problems of separatism in China. Now, the West has intentionally misrepresented, in my view, what is going on in Xinjiang. The West is frightened, intimidated, worried by the remorseless rise of China to become the #1 economic power. History tells us throughout the centuries that there is always conflict between a rising power and an established power. The Americans know this themselves. They refer to it as the Thucydides principle, which refers to Greek history. I won't go into that in detail, but the principle is there in history. Yeah. And you have a situation today where America has been the top international power for many years, certainly since 1945, probably earlier as well. And now, remorselessly, relentlessly, the big experiment in China, which the Americans disregarded for many years, has become increasingly successful. And China is poised to become the top economic power. Just bear in mind, this is a very difficult thing for the Americans to accept. That's why I say the issue of Xinjiang exists on its own, but it exists within the overarching geopolitical struggles between the rising economic power and the established economic power.
So how do you look at the measures that China or Xinjiang has been taking in order to handle terrorism or to prevent terrorism? What does it amount to in your eyes, and how far away, how detached is the Western narrative of so-called concentration camp in your eyes with reality?
First of all, I think the Chinese divided the people of Xinjiang into three groups, the Uyghurs into three groups, not Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. They divided them. There was the hardcore terrorists. That was the hardcore group of people, the leaders, the people that resorted to violence, the people that came to Beijing and stabbed ordinary pedestrians, that responsible for the Kunming railway explosion and other events. That's a small group of people. Behind them is a larger group of people, of followers, people who are influenced by the terrorists, but who aren't necessarily the terrorists. That's the second group. And then there's a third group, which is very important, which is the overwhelming majority of Uyghurs who live in Xinjiang and live in a happy, contented state. So as regards the first group, the terrorists, the Chinese action was resolute and firm. There were arrests, there were deaths, and I'm sure there were executions. But for the group in the middle, the large number of people who were influenced by terrorist thinking, the Chinese came up with the idea of re-education camps. This is something that the West calls concentration camps, and it is that over which there is much difference. Every government regards itself as entitled to take action against people who are trying to overthrow the government. I think China took a very significant difference of opinion, difference of action between the hardcore terrorists, who they regarded as enemies, and which any government would have regarded as enemies because they resorted to violence, and the larger number of followers who the Chinese wanted to wean away, take away from the ideology of violence and separatism. At first, the Chinese tried the time-honored method of arrest and prison. But they found, as the West has found, that if you put followers into prison with the extremists turn the followers into extremists. So the Chinese realized, I think, that they had to take decisive action to separate the hardcore terrorists from the followers, and it is the followers who they have compelled to engage in a re-education process. The West calls it brainwashing. The West calls it concentration camps. That's because the West wants to misrepresent what China is doing. But the reality is that China's been quite far-sighted in trying to save future deaths by educating many of the people who had sympathy with the separatists and winning them away from that destructive ideology.
Mr. Perry, you argued extensively against the idea of so-called genocide. Help us understand what conclusions you reached and how you reached that conclusion.
Well, there is a widely accepted definition of genocide set down by the United Nations. Basically, it means attempts to eliminate the existence of a group of people, whether they're defined by race, by nationality, or by some other definition. I'm Jewish, and I'm very conscious that the Jews were the victim by the Nazis of genocide. The Nazis killed 6 million Jews in the World War II. That is genocide. There have been allegations of genocide against the Rohingyas in Burma. There have been other instances of genocide in Serbia as well. There are many instances, historical examples of genocide. That said, each genocide has its own characteristics. But what was originally said about China by Pompeo in particular, the American Secretary of State, was that China was guilty of genocide. He didn't have the evidence of genocide. There weren't evidence of people being killed. There weren't evidence of crematoria. There wasn't evidence of people being put up against a wall and shot, which was the position that happened to the Jews in World War II. But what they have focused on is forced sterilization, and the allegation against the Chinese government is that they have sought to reduce the number of Uyghurs in the population by forcing women to undergo forced sterilization to make it impossible for them to be pregnant, with the long-term hope that that would reduce the number of Uyghurs being born in China. So that is the approach they have taken. Forced labor is a different matter, but the allegation of genocide really is very, very serious. And the question for me is, has it been proved? And here we come back to the very uncertain evidence of somebody called Adrian Zenz, and I have set that down in detail in my article. But I'm depending on the research and investigation done by non-Chinese sources. This is reflected in the recent program put on by the Hamilton Coalition in Canada, where they involved Grey Zone, Daniel Dumbrill, and other people to evidentially, step by step, go through the evidence of genocide in order to prove that there was no such genocide. I've looked at their work, I've looked at the numbers, and I find Adrian Zenz's evidence very, very weak.
It seems that these allegations have found quite a large number of audience, who are people who are very readily, accepting this idea. What exactly has happened? I mean, I'm sure there are other people who have independent, who can think for themselves as well in the West, and yet why are there not as many people in the political circle or in the media standing up and speak up against what they believe is falsehood?
I think there is a historical explanation for this, Shin, and this partly focuses on the history of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union came into power in 1917, it worried the Western countries, the capitalist countries, very, very significantly. There was fear of not simply revolution in Moscow, but revolution all over Europe. And the idea of a successful Marxist revolution across Europe worried the capitalists to their roots. So there is a lot of people look at China through the lenses of the Soviet Union. And there is an antipathy to any government that calls itself a communist government. Communism is not popular. Communism is associated with violence against the people. And it doesn't take a lot to stir up indignation and feeling on the issue of China by making a connection with the alleged genocide of the Uyghurs. As I said to you before at the beginning, for me, there isn't genocide, and for me, it is untruths, and for me, it is part of an overarching geopolitical battle between the Americans and China as to who is the top economic power. The Americans will not let go, and they think they can damage China if they persuade more and more people to believe that China is responsible for genocide. So this issue has to be confronted, has to be fought. People who believe that this is wrong and unfair to China, like myself, have to be prepared to speak out. There is a lot of willingness on the part of people who are anti-communist, have no sympathy for the communist way of government, to accept very, very unsubstantiated evidence of genocide. Now, in my opinion, this is very bad. Whether you're pro-China or anti-China, if you're going to throw around the term genocide, you need to be sure of your facts. And the basic fact that undermines Adrian Zenzi's investigation is that the number of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the population has increased rather than decreased. That is not a sign of genocide.
But help us understand your understanding with the so-called forced labor allegation that has also been circulating. What have you found out?
The allegation is that the Chinese uses a prison population to promote the production of goods that enter into the production chain of goods that arrive in European, American countries around the world. That is the allegation, and it's a third attempt to damage China's reputation by arguing that they're exploiting people who do this work because they are not paying them a proper wage, and that is why they give the title forced labor. China disputes this, says it's not true, and it's a matter of opinion. But you know, Xin, it is like this. If you want to believe something, you'll believe it even though the evidence isn't there.
Xinjiang is abundant in natural resources, and it also produces over 87% of China's cotton. As the biggest province in China, it accounts for 16% of China's total area. It is vital to China and Asia's stability, as it is in the center of the Asian and European continents. In the 19th century, the British Empire tried to separate Xinjiang from Qing dynasty, but the famous Chinese general, Zhou Zongtang, safeguarded the sovereign integrity by defeating the UK-backed rebel. China's BRI, short for Belt and Road Initiative, put Xinjiang at the top for its strategic location. That is one of the reasons why anti-China forces undermine Xinjiang to hinder the BRI project, which is more ambitious than the American Marshall Plan 70 years ago. If China succeeds in promoting its BRI project, its influence on Asia, Europe, and Africa will be unrivaled.
Xi is also facing a challenge to his authority from China's special administrative region, Hong Kong. Months of anti-government protests by pro-democratic forces have threatened to undermine political stability in the former British colony.
The peaceful handover of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to China in 1997 is a historical moment both for China and for the UK. China accomplished its first step to regain national unity and became a regional power, while the Great Britain sullenly rang down the curtain in Asia. The relationship between China and the UK deteriorated recently because of the Hong Kong national security law. China believed that the UK and other foreign forces were involved in the riot against Hong Kong legislation. The tension between these two countries further developed when the UK announced its scheme to give passport holders a path to residency as political freedoms decline in Hong Kong. Just several hours after, China declared that it will not recognize British national overseas passports as travel and identity documents, starting January 31, 2021. In February 2021, the UK stopped the broadcasting of China's news outlet, Global Times, in its territory, and Beijing retaliated soon, with its ban on BBC for its distorted and biased reports on China.
She warned against threats to national unity and sent a message to semi-autonomous Hong Kong and the self-ruled island of Taiwan.
No power can shake our great motherland's position. no power can stop the progress of the People's Republic of China and the people of China.
我们要坚持
We must uphold a peaceful one country, two systems principle, safeguard Hong Kong, Macau's prosperity and stability, and promote a peaceful development of cross-strait relations, unite all the Chinese people, and continue to realize the complete reunification of the motherland.
In March, China lashed out at the European Union, the UK and Canada over their criticism of alleged human rights violations in China's Xinjiang region. These latest moves are directed mainly at individuals rather than the billions of dollars in trade and investment that are at stake in its rift with Australia. In this context, Australia's experience stands as a cautionary tale of what can happen when China's full wrath is unleashed.
7 years ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping made an historic speech to the Australian Parliament, calling on Canberra and Beijing to expand cooperation and deepen trust. The two countries swiftly signed a free trade deal, which has embedded China as by far Australia's most important trade partner. But 7 years on, and bilateral relations have plummeted. Diplomatic ties are frozen, 2 Australians are detained in what critics allege is hostage diplomacy, and Beijing has slapped sanctions on Australian exports. There's no doubt that Xi Jinping has taken a far more aggressive approach to foreign policy than his predecessors, most notably pushing China's claims in the contested South China Sea, clamping down on Hong Kong's autonomy, and taking part in foreign influence operations in democratic nations. So this has really alarmed Canberra, which has deep financial and personal ties to Hong Kong. It has vital strategic interests in keeping trade routes open to Asian countries, and it also has a very large Chinese-Australian population at home. The election of Donald Trump and a much more strident US foreign policy towards China has also had an important influence in Canberra, which has a defence alliance with Washington. Australia's Conservative government has often taken the lead in pushing back against Beijing, a position that has really enraged Beijing and caused some of its domestic critics here in Australia to warn that Canberra risks abandoning its traditional position of not having to choose between its largest trading partner, China, and its strategic ally, Washington. There's been several significant trigger points over the past few years. In 2017, there was a political scandal here involving an MP and some money from a Chinese businessman. After that, Canberra started to formulate tough new foreign influence laws aimed at preventing overseas powers from meddling in internal politics and seeking to influence diaspora communities in Australia. So that was probably the first thing that angered Beijing. The second thing happened in 2018, and Australia was the first Western power to formally ban Huawei from its 5G network rollout. And this decision laid the groundwork for other nations to introduce similar rules. And so this really put Canberra in the crosshairs of Beijing. But perhaps the most extreme example of Canberra taking the lead was its decision last year to unilaterally call for an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. And in that process, it floated this idea of providing investigators with weapons inspector style powers. Now, unsurprisingly, this didn't go down very well in Beijing. And since then, we've seen Beijing really unleash this wolf warrior style diplomacy against Canberra. Since Canberra's call for an inquiry into COVID-19, Beijing has really started to target Australian exports through a range of different sanctions. So we've had anti-dumping tariffs imposed on barley and wine, and a host of technical trade barriers put against products from coal to timber. So this has begun to impact businesses operating in those specific sectors. For example, the wine industry in particular is finding it really difficult to find alternative markets for its products because China was its largest single market, accounting for about a third of total wine exports from Australia. However, the value of overall trade between the two nations, worth about $250 billion Australian dollars, has not so far suffered a huge downturn. And this is really due to the importance of iron ore exports to China from Australia. This makes up roughly half of the total of Australian exports to China. And what we've seen is iron ore prices have really been hovering near record highs, partly because the alternative market for China to get iron ore, Brazil, has had real problems due to the coronavirus and also due to dam failures there. So China hasn't been left with an alternative to get and source iron ore. So this has supported Australia's exports. But if we can really point to one area where we've seen a massive economic impact from this breakdown in diplomatic relations between China and Australia, it would have to be in investment flows. So the value of foreign direct investment into Australia fell 61% last year to just 1 billion Australian dollars. And this is really a massive drop compared to the peak years of Chinese investment into Australia. For example, in 2016, there was a total of 16.5 billion Australian dollars investment from China into Australia. And that made Australia one of the most important sources for Chinese investment in that year.
In 2001, with the support of the US, China joined the World Trade Organization. Bilateral trade boomed. Even chili sauce made in China found its way to American homes. In the next decade, the sense of patriotism and pride that the Chinese felt kept step with economic growth. October 1st, 2019. As mainland China celebrates the 70th anniversary of communism rule, Hong Kong is shaken by protests. As events escalated, the US and China clashed over Beijing's new national security law in Hong Kong. Washington criticized Beijing's move to undermine Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy, while Beijing accused Washington of interfering in its internal affairs. The trade war already made America seem an adversary to China in 2019. The American response to events in Hong Kong was like adding oil to fire. As debates still continue on whether or not the US had a hand in the unrest in Hong Kong, the US, in response to the national security law, ended the special status that it granted Hong Kong in diplomatic and trade relations. It also imposed sanctions to officials over their roles in cracking down on political dissent. The United States, superpower, world's biggest economy, home to the world's most powerful media and internet companies. There are many things that Americans can be proud of, all of which was built on its industrial backbone. But America has been grappling with something for 2 decades now: deindustrialization. From 2001 to 2007, the Dayton metro area lost almost 23,000 jobs. Nearly 1 in 3 local manufacturing jobs vanished. As that happened, the poverty rate here climbed to 34.5%, nearly 3 times the poverty rate nationwide. How did Dayton get here? At one point, it was considered the Silicon Valley of its age. To understand why what happened 20 years ago continues to reverberate in American politics today, we need to turn back the clock to 2001. That year, the US government supported the motion that China be allowed into the World Trade Organization.
Opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies to compete successfully in China's market while bringing increased prosperity to the people of China.
As factories moved overseas, some estimates were that 5 million manufacturing jobs were lost. Economists thought it would be temporary. But some communities never recovered from the shutdown of these factories.
We want democracy, not high-tech democracy. What do we do? They say free trade, we say no way.
Here at House of Bread, the number of people seeking aid has been increasing steadily every year. And then came the 2016 elections. Trump went to these Rust Belt towns and ran a campaign targeting China.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country.
Ohio voted for Trump in the 2020 elections. Studying the effects of trade is a complex matter. What would a company such as Apple have done without low-cost Chinese assembly workers? Without China, would manufacturing have moved out to India, Mexico, and Southeast Asia anyway? What about the robots and fancy machines that had supplanted workers? As heated debates continue about whether China was to blame for America's economic woes, a pandemic tears through the country. Millions of Americans have been infected with the coronavirus and hundreds of thousands have died. Even before the current crisis erupted, the Sino-American relationship was on life support. But the pandemic may have sounded its death knell. According to a Pew Research Center survey, 73% of US adults say they have an unfavorable view of China. 78% also placed a great deal or fair amount of the blame for the global spread of the coronavirus on the Chinese government's initial handling of the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan. Around 1 in 4 describes China as an enemy of the US. The timing of the warnings that came from China to the world is a matter of dispute between China and the US that is unresolved. China state media produced a clip around this, targeted at an English-speaking audience.
December.
Strange pneumonia cases reported.
Roger that. January.
We discovered a new virus.
So what?
It's dangerous.
It's only a flu.
Wear a mask.
Don't wear a mask.
Stay at home.
It's violating human rights.
Amidst the heartache and destruction, the politics of blame has taken root. To add insult to injury, China claims to have just had about 85,000 cases and less than 5,000 deaths in a nation of 1.4 billion. The US has a death toll that's more than 60 times over. In the months leading to the elections, both Biden and Trump have taken out advertisements blaming China. The election may be over, but for many, the reckoning will continue. In China, a dual circulation economic model is underway to mitigate the effects of protectionism. Both superpowers brace for the possibility of a financial war. China's direct investment in the US dropped from $5.4 billion in 2018 to $5 billion in 2019, the lowest level since the recession year of 2009. And from January to March 2020, Chinese direct investment in the US virtually vanished to just $200 million. The moderate views of the people of Iowa are currently in a minority in the US. According to polls, a record high number of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. Biden is expected to continue a tough approach to Beijing. America alleges that China has damaged its economy. And the list of accusations are long: IP theft, currency manipulation, and unfair trade practices, leading to a trade deficit that reached over $400 billion in 2018, the year the trade war started. But to understand how that deficit happened, we need to turn the clock back to 1999. That was the year Chinese and US negotiators signed a historic trade deal that paved the way for China to join the World Trade Organization.
An agreement of this sort, with its breadth, with its scope, can help to anchor the relationship between the United States and China in a most fundamental way. And from that anchor, I think other good things will emerge.
Whether the US gained more than it lost in trading with China is still a subject of heated debate in the US. What's indisputable is a trade deficit of over $300 billion. A trade war was launched in 2018. It is still unclear whether the new administration will put a stop to it. The US was once a stronghold of solar module manufacturing, accounting for around a quarter of global solar module shipments in the early 2000s. But that started changing around 2010. US solar manufacturers were going broke. But the overall industry was growing fast. People found employment selling and installing the China solar modules. 2016 was the best year on record for solar energy in the United States. Helped by cheap imports, solar installations doubled. That year, it seemed as though solar energy was about to revolutionize the energy sector and end American dependency on fossil fuels. Then, Trump got elected.
No more tariffs on the sun. Solar jobs for everyone. No more tariffs on the sun. Solar jobs for everyone. No more tariffs on the sun.
China solar modules were slapped with a 30% tariff in 2018 under Trump's trade war. The industry's top trade group, the US Solar Industries Association, said solar installations plummeted as prices went up. 62,000 jobs in the solar industry were lost due to tariffs. A few solar module manufacturing plants did open, but the jobs created were overshadowed by those lost. Around 62,000 jobs were shed because of the tariffs. Across the Pacific Ocean, Chinese businessmen too are reeling from the fallout of superpower rivalry. In one factory in Dongguan, it has been a roller coaster year for business. For over a decade, Matsutech built its business as an OEM manufacturer for big Western brands. OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer, and they're a class of companies that produces equipment that are then sold by someone else. In Matsutech's case, they supplied firms such as Philips and Honeywell. That strategy paid off for 2 decades, helping Matsutech grow into the world's second largest maker of robotic vacuum cleaners. But then, the trade war hit in 2019, and the company joined a long list of corporate casualties. Time for a rethink of corporate strategy. Matsutech switched its focus to its own Jiawei Shi and Papazhou vacuum cleaners, promoting them on China's e-commerce platforms. Instead of focusing on the US markets as OEM manufacturers, they will now focus on the China market. Companies across China are now beginning to think the same way. President Xi emphasized that Chinese companies must now pursue a new development strategy he calls dual circulation and move away from export-led growth. China needs this domestic circulation model to work. The WTO projected that even under a relatively optimistic scenario, the volume of world merchandise trade in 2020 would contract by 9%. It's clear the days of 20+% export growth are over for China. Matsutech is one amongst hundreds of Chinese suppliers now decoupling with their American clients. Companies like Nintendo, GoPro, Hasbro have accelerated plans to build factories in places such as India, Vietnam, and Mexico. There are many examples of decoupling in the press, but survey results reveal a different truth. It seems most American companies are not headed back home. Only about 4% of the more than 200 manufacturers surveyed by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai said they will shift any production to the US. More than 75% said they don't intend to move production out of China, while 14% said they will shift some operations to other countries, and 7% planned on relocating domestically. Decoupling, it seems, is a greater focus in policy circles rather than actual business circles. Whether it is Starbucks, Apple, or General Motors, scores of American brands must continue to operate in China, as the market is simply too big to give up. The US-China Business Council, a trade group representing more than 200 US companies that do business with China, polled its members in June 2020. They found that up to 83% of the companies counted China as either the top or among the top 5 priorities for their company's global strategy. It's been a bruising trade war for US and China. And in recent months, there are concerns that the trade and technology war might expand into a volatile new front: finance. A financial war will weaponize capital. In 2020, the US government moved to prevent a federal retirement fund from investing billions of dollars in shares of Chinese companies. A bill to force Chinese companies to delist from US stock exchanges if they do not open their books to US regulators was also passed unanimously by the Senate in May the same year. What could a financial war look like? One scenario, a dispute over SWIFT. The world pays for practically everything, mainly using the SWIFT International Payment Network. Every day, $5 trillion US gets transferred across the world using this system. Questions that used to be unthinkable are now being considered. Could the US sanction China through this SWIFT dollar payment system? Or could it order the big banks which clear dollar payments in America to stop serving Chinese banks? There is a massive experiment underway in China, which hints at how seriously the country is responding to the threat of financial war. President Xi has designated blockchain to be one of the country's top innovation priorities. And China pushed ahead with trials of its new digital currency, taking early tentative steps that could one day free the world from relying on the dollar for international transactions. To understand how a digital yuan works, first, look to the cashless payment ecosystem in China. Even a trip to a place of worship is cashless. E-wallets and systems like WeChat Pay and Alipay are now dominant instead of cash. And widespread adoption of cashless payments have paved the way for China's central bank to begin experimenting with the digital yuan. In 2020, China became the first major economy to conduct a real-world test of a national digital currency. China's digital currency is now being trialed in 4 Chinese cities domestically. but the ultimate aim is to accelerate the internationalization of the yuan. China's former central bank governor said China's digital currency aims to push back against US dollar hegemony. China is the top trading partner of many countries, but its years-long ambition of internationalizing the yuan has progressed slowly. The yuan accounted for about 2% of global reserves and 1.76% of cross-border payments by June 2020. An ambitious plan for a digital yuan could set the motion for change, starting with China's borders with ASEAN. In the US, the digital yuan experiment is raising concern. Systems like SWIFT has given the US leverage over other states, as sanctions that cut a country off from this network are usually a death sentence. Iran is a case in point. Washington has been increasingly relying on sanctions as a foreign policy tool. But the sharpness of that tool is now in question as China's digital currency takes root globally. It is precisely because of US financial sanctions that Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, has been embroiled in a lawsuit in Canada and unable to return to China. Such cases may become a thing of the past if China's digital currency takes root. Trade war, financial war, and a war of words. These are the legacy of the Trump presidency. So profound has been its impact that the legacy is likely to continue in the new administration. Chinese students started pouring into the US after the 2008 financial crisis, when many universities started wooing them for revenue purposes. Across America, universities adopted a similar strategy. From 2008 to 2018, the number of Chinese students in the US more than quadrupled. China was the largest source of international students to American universities, making up 1/3 of the 1.1 million foreign students there. They generated about $14 billion in revenue for US colleges. And perhaps an even bigger amount in intangible assets. But as tensions between the two countries heat up, Chinese students across America found themselves embroiled in the tussle. Chinese who went to the US to study, once seen as a great boon to America, are now often treated as saboteurs or spies. The number of US student visas granted to applicants in China came to just 808 in the 6 months through September, down 99% from over 90,000 in the same period a year earlier. The White House has said that China is engaged in a wide-ranging and heavily resourced campaign to acquire sensitive United States technologies and intellectual property. The PRC authorities use some Chinese students, mostly postgraduate students and postdoctorate researchers, to operate as non-traditional collectors of intellectual property. China, on its part, has a 1,000 Talents Plan, which is a government project to attract scientists, and in particular, ethnic Chinese scientists. Companies around the world are bracing for a fallout from superpower rivalry, and no company has made more news than Huawei. Despite claims and controversy surrounding the company, Huawei's campus, tucked away at the fringes of Shenzhen City, is an oasis of calm. Inside these medieval-themed office blocks, researchers work on the future of telecommunications technology. The US has banned Huawei from its future 5G networks, and it has pressured its allies to do the same. Huawei's 5G network products are now banned in countries from UK to Poland to Sweden. Huawei was also added to Washington's entity list on national security concerns. This means the company cannot buy American software without US government approval, which means no more Google Android operating system for its phones. Another company caught in the crosshairs of a tech war is TikTok. If you haven't already downloaded it, TikTok is an app devoted to viral dance crazes, cat videos, and a whole load of teenage pranks. Can this app really be a high-tech spying application stealing your secrets on behalf of the communist regime, as many in Washington claim? Critics have accused TikTok of scrubbing videos supportive of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong and videos critical of the Chinese government's actions in Xinjiang. TikTok has denied both accusations. A tech war has casualties on both sides, and it is also going to cost the world dearly. A report from Deutsche Bank estimates the costs of the tech war at more than $3.5 trillion over the next 5 years. If the tech war continues unabated, this could be what the global tech infrastructure looks like. With rival internet platforms, telecom infrastructure regimes, CPU architectures, operating systems, satellite communication networks, IoT networks, and payment systems with very little interoperability or interaction. Countries and companies may have to choose between a US tech regime or a China tech regime, or they will simply have to bear the costs of running both. To strip out one technology is very painful and expensive. For example, asking a nation like Germany to strip out Huawei from their network would cost tens of billions of euros, delaying infrastructure build and hurting job creation. But staying the course would ensure a strong diplomatic reaction from the US with unforeseen outcomes. For corporates, it would mean having two different communication and networking standards across countries to ensure interoperability. Product design would be a lot more challenging, as they would no longer be able to design once and sell everywhere without incurring additional costs of complying with two different standards. This is Tesla's Gigafactory in Shanghai, built with $1.6 billion in loans from Chinese banks. Construction of this factory started in 2018, and electronic vehicles, or EVs, made here started shipping in December 2019 to the Chinese market. Case in point that proves American businesses, despite political pressures, can't ignore the size of the world's second largest market. In a way, Tesla has Trump to thank. Due to US pressure, China has allowed Tesla to be the first car plant in China to operate without a local partner. It is wholly foreign-owned, and the plant has paid off well for Tesla. It sold more than 50,000 cars in China in the first 6 months of 2020. With original engineering, Tesla China creates original IP that will not be subjected to future US sanctions. Political risks loom large. Yet scores of American companies, big and small, continue to flock to China to do business. Many of them come to Shenzhen, known as the Silicon Valley of China. Shenzhen, and not New York, was also the world's best performing stock market in 2020. One American company with operations here is Hacks, a startup accelerator from the US that also offers venture funding. Hacks has a portfolio of more than 200 startups from sectors like smartphone devices, Internet of Things, robotic kits, and medical devices. There is one place that is central to startups with hacks, and that's Huaqiang Bay, the biggest electronics market in the world. Huaqiang Bay is where you can find the parts that make up smartphones and TV and tablets. This is where many of the world's selfie sticks and hoverboards come from. All the tools you need to build anything you want. And once you find it, you can get that component in 1 hour, and you can order 1,000 of it. Shenzhen is China's intellectual property center. According to the United Nations World Intellectual Property Organization, China accounted for nearly half of global patent filings in 2018, with a record 1.54 million applications, led by telecoms and computer technology. The United States ranked a distant second, with nearly 600,000 patent applications. According to the Chinese media, Shenzhen serves as the home base for more than half of the country's patent applicants. IP theft. It's one of the chief concerns of the US. IP theft is, of course, age-old. The oldest known recognition of IP rights came thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. The Persian rulers of Samarkand stole the secret of papermaking from the Chinese on the ancient Silk Road. And more recently, the British stole the secret of processing tea leaves from the Chinese, a secret that was pivotal to the empire of the East India Company. Industrial espionage is as old as industry itself. But is China still a clone factory? In China's manufacturing hub Dongguan, evidence shows that the US campaign to contain China's rise is in fact spurring its industries to accelerate design and invention. Whether it's through hard work, sheer genius, technology theft, or a combination of all three, China is now a global tech powerhouse. As of 2019, it has more unicorns than the US. Unicorns are privately held startup companies valued at over $1 billion. They are such a statistical rarity, hence the reference to the mythical animal. China has 206 such firms, while the US has 203. Globally, there are 494 unicorns. China is also doubling down on its spending on research. The National People's Congress unveiled a 5-year plan in which China will invest close to $1.4 trillion in building new infrastructure through AI, data centers, 5G, the industrial internet, and other new technologies. Chinese policymakers especially seek to reduce their country's dependence on the US for semiconductors. In October 2019, Beijing established a $29 billion semiconductor fund. The facial recognition toilet paper dispenser is just one of a huge range of AI tech widely adopted in China today. AI is being used to control traffic in hundreds of smart cities. It is used in factories, in restaurants, at ports, and in data centers. And the US alleges that AI is also being used in Xinjiang to suppress Uyghur minorities. China is fast closing the technological gap with America. And though it may not match US capabilities across the board, it will soon be one of the leading powers in AI. China and the US are bracing for a long-term tech rivalry, one that will likely not change course with a Biden presidency. Over the past 4 years, the Sino-US rivalry has been boon and bane for Southeast Asia. Amid mounting pressure for countries in the region to pick a side, ASEAN states straddle a tightrope, caught in the throes of a clash between titans. Southeast Asia, a vast melting pot of cultures and influences. "11 countries shaped by centuries of trade and episodes of Western imperialism. One country stands out among the pack, the Philippines. It's the only country to have been colonized by the United States. The American occupation left a deep and lasting legacy on the Philippines. The American heritage continues to influence how Filipinos view international affairs, especially Sino-US competition. Just as Filipinos' ties with the US are steeped in history, relations with China go a long way back too. Neighboring Manila is home to the world's oldest Chinatown. Established in the late 1500s, it's a symbol of over 5 centuries of trade and commerce with China. And today, China ranks third amongst countries contributing the most to the Philippines' trade and investment. One of the places the Chinese are parking their money is the old Clark Air Base. Given Clark's strategic location just off the South China Sea, news of Chinese cash flowing into the old American Air Base has attracted some controversy. Since coming into office in 2016, President Duterte has made infrastructure development a priority. To help realize his grand vision, known as the Build, Build, Build scheme, he has secured billions of dollars in pledged infrastructure funding from China. In reality, most of the pledged money from China has yet to materialize. But observers believe this will have little effect on President Duterte's pivot to Beijing, which has come amid intense competition between the US and China for influence over Southeast Asia. Both superpowers regard the region as a key plank in the international trading system. Nestled in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City's downtown is this iconic restaurant. Pho 2000 is a household name across the country, not just for the signature noodle broth, but because of a visit from a famous American in the year 2000. US President Bill Clinton's visit officially signified the normalizing of relations between US and Vietnam 25 years after the Vietnam War. Today, Vietnam's economy is heavily reliant on America. The country makes $60 billion a year selling goods to the US, its biggest export market. Even in the midst of a pandemic, Vietnam remained one of the world's fastest growing economies in 2020. It's not just America that Vietnam has to thank for that impressive statistic. In recent years, the rise of China has created new opportunities for the Southeast Asian nation. China is now Vietnam's top trading partner with two-way bilateral trade valued at over $100 billion. China ranks third in the list of largest investors in Vietnam. The United States is notably absent from the top 3. Despite this, many Vietnamese still favor strong relations with the United States over China. However, on the economic front, recent developments in the trade war have heated up competition among members of the regional bloc.
We're taking in billions of dollars of tariffs. In the old days, we made our product and we took our product and that's what it was. Now we go to China, we buy it. Not anymore. And if they don't want to pay tariffs, make it here or buy it from another country that's a non-tariffed country.
The US-China trade war has disrupted global supply chains. but ASEAN countries have found new opportunities amidst the chaos. As factories moved out of China to escape US tariffs, many set up in ASEAN. One destination in particular seemed especially inviting. Over in neighboring Thailand, Delta Electronics, headquartered in Taiwan, makes components for the likes of Huawei and Microsoft. It's shifted some of its production from China to what is now Southeast Asia's other manufacturer's paradise. Delta Thailand has been operating here since the 1980s. It has 6 factories. A 7th is well on the way. These sentiments are shared across ASEAN. For the past 2 years, countries in the region have been jostling to catch a share of the investment flowing out of China. If Vietnam and Thailand are the early victors of the trade war, Indonesia is arguably the biggest loser in the race to attract manufacturers seeking to bypass tariffs. Today, Indonesia is making up for its late start. It's actively courting foreign investments, most notably from China. One recent deal with Beijing could be a lifesaver. Iwan Setiawan works for Biopharma. The state-run pharmaceutical firm is working with the Chinese to distribute the China-made Sinovac vaccine in Indonesia. They've received nearly 3 million doses so far, along with raw materials and the recipe for Indonesia to reproduce the vaccine themselves. Indonesia was given priority access by China to its vaccine, due in part because amongst countries in the region, Indonesia is most embattled by the pandemic. The country was also chosen to be the distribution hub for Sinovac in Southeast Asia, a useful step towards the government's plans for a national inoculation program in 2021. Indonesia hopes to keep such meaningful collaborations going with China. But like many other countries in the region, it needs to balance this with its relations with the US. The regional grouping ASEAN could provide a possible solution. Despite the best efforts from both superpowers to lure countries in the region to their respective sides, the 10 ASEAN states have collectively committed to remain neutral. Newly minted US President Joe Biden is expected to be tough on China. Yet his presidency marks a clean sheet for diplomacy between Beijing and Washington. There are still many issues that China and the US need to work out between them. And some of these issues may never be resolved. But now's the time for both sides to seek common ground and find ways to foster healthy competition. Southeast Asia looks forward to being part of this conversation and working together with both superpowers. In doing so, they hope to disentangle themselves from the dangerous tightrope they've been walking.
Tensions between the US and China have been steadily escalating as they spar on everything from democracy in Hong Kong to the data security of TikTok. But there's one place where a military battle between the superpowers is most likely to happen: the South China Sea. What started as a territorial dispute over rocks and reefs grew into clashes over fishing and natural resources. Now, the South China Sea is home to escalating war games between two of the world's largest militaries. So, how did an East Asian dispute over a group of small islands become a significant flashpoint for US-China relations? The South China Sea encompasses 1.4 million square miles, making it almost 1.5 times bigger than the Mediterranean Sea. It's a key commercial gateway, that sees 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping pass through it every year, accounting for more than $3 trillion in trade. Beneath the surface, the maritime life is vital to the diets and economies of the surrounding nations. Around 12% of the global fish catch comes from these waters, which also hosts more than half of the world's fishing vessels. Even further down, beneath the seabed, is the promise of natural gas and crude oil reserves. The exact amount is disputed, with both the US and China giving vastly different estimates. The US estimates that the sea holds about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil. For decades, China and neighbouring Southeast Asian nations have disputed territorial claims within the area, largely centred around two groups of islands: the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north. Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam all have claims in the region, but it's China's claims that are the most contentious. China claimed more than 80% of the South China Sea, referring to a map from 1947 that shows a U-shaped line looping down to a point about 1,100 miles or 1,800 kilometres south of its Hainan Island.
China's claim in the South China Sea emerged between 1907 and 1947, in those 40 years. And it really emerged in the context of China struggling against foreign powers in the first half of the 20th century. Against Japan, and then later against France, and then against Japan again during the Second World War. It became an emotional question. It became a time when China wanted to stand up against the world, and one way of doing that was by staking a claim to territory.
But Beijing didn't start actively asserting this claim until later in the 20th century.
It's really when oil gets discovered in certain parts of the South China Sea in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that's when it starts to heat up a bit more, and you start to see more of the islands being occupied. Philippines moves in the 70s, the Vietnamese also do the same thing, and then the Malaysians get in the game. The Chinese government doesn't make its first occupations, actually physically planting the flag in the Spratly Islands, until 1988, so they come very late to the game at that point.
In the years that followed, nations jostled among themselves for control of the islands, but since the mid-1990s, the occupation of most parts of the Spratly and Paracel Islands hadn't changed significantly. But as China's position on the world stage grew, so too did their activity in the region. Beijing transformed the disputed reefs and rocks by reclaiming 670 acres of land from the sea to create islands with administrative buildings, hospitals, and sport complexes. There's also runways that can land fighter jets and are equipped with defensive systems, radar antennae, and radio systems, which are intended to monitor the area around them. China's use of the islands in this way prevents other countries developing resources, and that directly breaches the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS. UNCLOS was established in 1982, and it states that a country can have a territorial zone of 12 nautical miles off its coast, a further 12 nautical miles where it has limited controls, and an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles. China argues that the Paracel and Spratly Islands are part of its territory, and therefore they own anything within those exclusive economic zones, be it fish or natural resources, and it's been enforcing this in increasingly hostile ways. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that the Paracel and Spratlys were rocks rather than islands, and therefore would not get the benefits of EEZs. The ruling also stated that there was no legal basis for China's claims. Diplomats in China and ASEAN countries have turned their attention to an earlier legally binding document in the hope of a resolution.
The US's response in the South China Sea has been mainly driven from its sort of overall strategic interests, because the South China Sea connects America's west coast from California to the Indian Ocean and to the Middle East, and so they see it as a vital strategic corridor for them, for civilian shipping but also military shipping to go through.
A US presence has been increasing in the region since 2012. Over the years, administrations have waded in on arguments over resources, but haven't taken sides in the territorial disputes until now. Expansion of the Chinese Navy has become one of the latest concerns for US and ASEAN nations. Beijing's anti-ship ballistic missiles are also known as carrier killers. A Department of Defense report suggests that China may be the first ever to attach this category of weapon to a warship.
There's a good reason to think that a lot of China's activities in the South China Sea in terms of building up its bases are done with a possible invasion of Taiwan in mind. They're thinking that if there was ever an invasion, an attempt to forcibly bring Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, that the United States would try and defend Taiwan. And having these islands there with missiles already on them and runways and so forth would be a way of keeping the Americans at bay. It's also, I think, part of trying to create a bastion, a hiding place for their ballistic missile submarines there, and a way of just keeping the Americans away from their southern coast.
The escalation of military activities in the South China Sea, even in the midst of a pandemic, has many onlookers concerned.
In the final waning days of the Trump administration, you've seen a slew of measures taken, and I think a lot of those measures have been taken to try and prevent Joe Biden's administration from coming in and undoing a lot of what President Trump had put into place during his time in office.
A reporter from China Daily asked Hua Chunying about Blinken's address at NATO on March 24, 2021. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken reportedly delivered a speech at NATO headquarters, saying that China's militarization of the South China Sea threatens navigation freedom. He also claimed that China's retaliatory sanctions against the EU emphasized the importance of NATO unity. He warned NATO that China undermined the international system's rules and Western values, threatening the collective security and prosperity of the US and Europe. What is China's response to this? Hua Chunying derided the US Secretary of State's remarks. She ridiculed that the US official's statement proved once again the US side has given itself super freedom to making false statements and blaming others at will. China's principle and position on the relevant issues are unequivocal, and she has stated it many times. Today she wanted to emphasize a few more points. Firstly, it was not China that initiated the militarization of the South China Sea. China only carries out construction or deploys necessary armaments in its islands. The US side cannot deprive China of its right to self-protection and self-defense of its territory. The United States has not been at war for only 16 years, in nearly 250 years of its history. It has more than 800 overseas military bases across the world, and has ranked number 1 in the world in military expenditures for many years, accounting for 40% of total global military expenses. The United States is more than 8,300 miles away from the South China Sea. Still, it has established many military bases and deployed offensive weapons nearby. It sends aircraft carriers and strategic bombers into the South China Sea all year long, with the regular deployment of many military aircraft and warships to deter China. And it even impersonates the address codes of other countries' civil aviation in the South China Sea for hundreds of times to perform military duties to engage in militarization and safeguard the so-called freedom of navigation. It is the US that militarized the South China Sea, if any. Secondly, it is not China that has been trespassing the international rules. There is only one accepted system in the world, the international system with the United Nations as the core. There is only one set of rules, that is, the basic norms of international relations, based on the principles of the UN Charter. The US has quitted so many international organizations over the years, and has torn off so many treaties. With a bottle of laundry detergent as the proof of WMD, it invaded Iraq. With a video clip of recruited actors as the proof, it invaded Syria. In those two sovereign countries, it caused countless civilian casualties and the breaking up of numerous families. Apart from direct military invasions, the US and its allies also impose unilateral and illegal sanctions against other sovereign countries. If there is one country in the world that violates international order, it is the United States, not China. Thirdly, China is not undermining the US and Western values. The world is diverse and civilizations are different. The United States and several of its allies only account for about 10% of the world's population. There are so many developing countries, not to mention that not all the US allies have an entirely consistent position. American values are by no means equal to international values, and American-style democracy is by no means equivalent to universal democracy. It is the US and the West themselves that are destroying US and Western values. The Chinese want to get their own affairs in order and have neither the interest nor the energy to undermine other nations' values. We hope that the US side will correctly understand itself and others, abandon the zero-sum game and Cold War mentality, learn to deal with other countries on the basis of equality and mutual respect, and assume the important responsibility of great powers for world peace and development.
In talking about current challenges, the US-China trade war intentions, for example, their responses are consistently measured. China, according to them, has been facing obstacles and hardships at every turn in their 5,000 years of civilization, and not just on this occasion of their 70th anniversary. This is but a small hiccup on the spectrum of time.